So back in high school, if you were to ask me, I guess the proverbial question is like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what were you going to go to college for? Like whenever you're anywhere older than a sophomore in high school, you've got people constantly asking you, where are you going to go to school? What are you going to study? And back when I was 16, 17, even into like later into my senior year at 18 years old, I told everyone that I wanted to be a high school math teacher. And I know for some of you, you're like, math? You wanted to go to secondary education and teach math? Yes, I did. Okay, and let me tell you why. I actually had a lot of high school teachers that I loved, that were energetic, they were engaging, they were fun. Not necessarily my math teachers, my history teachers, and a couple others that I really enjoyed. But math was the subject that I was the best at. It came pretty naturally to me, and I was like, okay, cool. If I'm going to teach a subject in high school, I'm going to teach math because I feel like I would be the best at that. And I really admired my high school teachers. Specifically, a few of them that I knew were Christ followers. And they were able to really do this well, where they could engage their faith inside of their role as a high school teacher. Some of them served in Young Life, which was I was a part of Young Life as a high school student, and I watched them do this balance so well, which we know culturally is really challenging. To love kids and love students really well, to see them not as a student in their history or their psychology or their math class, but as a student who hopefully at some point will receive the hope of Jesus. And it got me really excited, and I really wanted to pursue it. And if I'm honest, I think I would have done pretty well at that. But as I was pursuing school, I was going to go to K-State and get my degree in secondary education. K-State's in Manhattan, Kansas. And there's also a small Christian college in Manhattan, Kansas called Manhattan Christian. And what I was going to do is I was going to dual enroll. So I was going to do my secondary education at K-State, and then I was going to get a minor in ministry at Manhattan Christian College. And up until literally like my second semester of senior year, that's what I was pursuing. And then I had some friends that I had grew up with in Chicagoland, in the Chicago suburbs, and they were like, hey, we're going to Cornerstone University, and we're going to apply for this scholarship. And Cornerstone was like a liberal arts college that was like a Bible school, but you didn't have to get a Bible or ministry degree. You could get a variety of other degrees. And so I was like, oh, okay. And they're like, hey, you should apply for this scholarship. I'm like, well, I'm planning to do this, but why not? All right, why not? I'll apply for this scholarship. And apparently there was a grant that was given to the school that was a pastoral leadership scholarship. So you'd get recommended by a pastor, and they would say, hey, here's the leadership giftings that this student has displayed inside and outside of the church. So I applied for the scholarship literally the day before it was due. I found out for like 3 days, and then we got this done. We followed up with one of my pastors in Chicago, and he fills this out, and we submit it. I'm like, all right, well, if God opens that door, maybe I'll shift my focus. And spoiler alert, he did. I mean, I got the scholarship was a full tuition scholarship for 4 years at Cornerstone. And it was in this moment that all right, I thought it was going to be just 2.5 hours from home. Now I'm going to be about 11 hours from home. Am I going to continue to pursue secondary education? I think they might have had a secondary ed department, but I had looked and researched, and then I'm sitting in my small group with a bunch of high school guys, and I'm watching us interact and engage because of the gospel. And I had this moment where I felt like God literally spoke to me. He's like, I want you to create communities of people that do and do not know Jesus. And so I shifted my focus completely. I knew I was going to go to Cornerstone, and it was at that point that I said, all right, I'm going to pursue my degree in ministry. And made this complete 180 shift to where I thought I was going, ultimately to where God was leading me to be. Now you're probably asking yourself, what does that story have to do with Christmas? And if you think about it at face value, nothing. I mean, really, it's not a Christmas-centric story. I'm not talking about lights and trees, and really not even about baby Jesus. But it does, for me, mirror a part of the Christmas story that we don't talk about that much. So we're in the series called Eyewitness, week 4 to be exact. We've been diving in over the last several weeks into the story of Christmas through the lens, the eyewitness accounts of different characters in the story. Week 1, we looked at Mary. Week 2, we looked at Joseph. Week 3, we look at the shepherds. And here we are for week 4, and we're looking through the Christmas story through the lens of the lesser known character, I think, in the story, and that's the lens of the Magi. Or they've been historically known as the 3 wise men. We're going to dive into that in a little bit. Now, what's interesting about the Magi, we don't really know too much about them. We don't know who they are. We kind of know where they came from. But before I dive in and unpack what I've learned about them and who they were and really what I think that their eyewitness account means for the story, why don't we just read the entirety of Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 18, which is essentially the entirety of the account of where the Magi are and why they show up on the scene. So let's dive in here. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the chief priests and the teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. So he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I may too go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child and his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures, and they presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. He said, "Get up." He said, "Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, he took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so it was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I've called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. He gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and in its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." Okay, there is a ton going on in this story. And if we're honest with ourselves, and if I'm honest with myself, this is the part of the Jesus birth story that I rarely dive into. Like, I love talking about Mary and Mary's prayer and Joseph and experiencing the dream from God and the shepherds who encounter the angels. Like, this is the story. And of course, if you have a nativity scene, the Magi do show up and they give their gifts. And we talk about them, and that's about as far as we ever really go. But why is there no love for the Magi? Why don't we like to talk about them as much? I would say there's probably a couple reasons that we choose to leave them out of the story or dive into their account. We don't really know much about them. I kind of talked about that already. But as I was preparing for today, in this talk, I tried to learn as much about the Magi as I could and give you a little bit of the window onto why they show up, why Matthew is the only one that chooses to include their account in the gospel, and maybe why we get to experience their story today, what God was trying to tell us through their story. So here's what scholars have gathered about the Magi. So the Magi, they were likely philosophers, astrologers, or astronomers, or some combination of all three, okay? And it's assumed that they came from this region of Orient, which was a region that was east of Jerusalem and east of most of modern-day Israel. Really, it says this, like Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, right at the beginning, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. So that's the context clue we have, understanding the region in which they existed. Now, the next question we have to ask is like, why did they show up? Because they show up in Jerusalem, right? They're supposed to end up, eventually, we'll find out they're going to end up in Bethlehem and they're going to see Jesus. But they show up in Jerusalem, and when they show up in Jerusalem, they make this statement. And they say, and this is really Matthew 2, verse 2, "Where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him." So based on historical accounts of the region of Orient, it is assumed that the Magi were likely Jews who had been exiled from the land of Judah and the Israelite people centuries before Jesus. Like many generations would have passed since their exile when the Magi show up on the scene. So here's what we're assuming. We're assuming here, there's some assumptions to be made that there's a reason that they're showing up to meet King Jesus. So if the Magi were exiled from Judah many centuries, they were essentially from the Jewish lineage, and they would have known, likely, about the prophecies about the coming Messiah. Now, the same prophecies that the Jewish people living in Jerusalem and living in Israel at the time would have known, based on oral tradition, we would assume that the Magi from Orient would have known the same. Although they were no longer the Israelite people, God's chosen people, they were living in a cultural context that was different. They would have known the history. Now, they weren't probably followers of the God of Israel. They were astrologers, astronomers, likely pagans, following the stars as their understanding and their religion. Again, remember, many centuries have passed since they've been exiled. But they know, or at least we understand that they probably know, that a Messiah was going to come. And like the Jews living in Israel, their assumption was that a Messiah was going to come. He was going to come as a militant king, the king of the Jews, and hopefully he was going to overthrow the Roman Empire. And it would be understood that the Israelites of the day are expecting Jesus to show up as this militant king. He's going to overthrow the Roman oppression, and they're going to finally be free, and they will follow King Jesus as they take charge to grow his kingdom here on earth. And then the Magi in Orient would have thought the same thing. But their hope would have been this, that Jesus shows up on the scene as this militant king. He overthrows the Roman government, and then the region of Orient becomes the supreme power of that day and steps in as the military force and watches their region reign supreme. So we've got two differing beliefs, but they're showing up potentially with an alternative motive. As astronomers and astrologers, they're constantly studying the stars and changes in the atmosphere and as much as they could understand at that day. And so when this massive star shows up, they think, okay, does this go back to any of our prophecies that we believe? An astronomer and astrologer, we go, okay, cool. A star is showing up, we should probably follow it. What does that mean? How does that affect the people of our day? And so they follow it. Now, we don't really know how the Star of David shows up on the scene. Does it literally like hover over Bethlehem? Or is it up in the star and they kind of walk in that direction? I don't think we'll really have the answer to that question, but it was compelling enough that they remembered back to their prophecy and they're like, this could be the marker that the King of the Jews has arrived. As it turns out, as they're following the star, it leads them to Jerusalem and not Bethlehem. And we don't know if this was like an intentional or accidental sidestep. But what we know is that their encounter with Jerusalem is going to have some cultural impacts, right? And if you jump back to the passage that we just read, they're going to have an encounter with King Herod. King Herod was the king of the region of Judah inside the Roman Empire, right? So you have Caesar Augustus, who is the emperor, and then you've got King Herod as a king, or a pawn, if you will, of a region inside, the region of the Jewish people inside the Roman Empire. Still not a favorable character to the Jews at the time. And he's pretty paranoid, pretty highly angered, definitely irrational at times. And like most kings of the New and Old Testament, they were constantly fearful that someone was going to take their power. Constantly fearful. So any threat against their power, they would do their best to eliminate. And so when the Magi from the east show up, and they're looking for the king of the Jews, which he would have called himself, King Herod gets pretty deeply concerned. So at that point, he gathers all the scribes, the teachers of the law. He probably gets the Magi all into one room. He goes, okay, what does your Bible, what are your scrolls, what do they tell you about the King of the Jews, this Messiah? And so they literally read this. It's in Matthew 2, verse 6, but it's an adaptation or a prophecy from Micah chapter 5 in the Old Testament. And it says this, "But to you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." So paranoid Herod, he gets the Magi together in a secret place. He's like, all right, when did the star show up? When? Tell me exactly when. He's like, I want to know how many days have passed. How old is this kid right now? And I want you to do this. Here's what I want you to do. Why don't you go find him for me in Bethlehem so that I can go in and worship him? As if we actually believe that King Herod was going to go worship the Messiah, Jesus. We obviously know his plan. We know he's trying to eliminate any threat to his power. So again, they head out. They see the star over Bethlehem, and they're stoked. They're absolutely overjoyed. And I've got to assume, okay, I'm putting on my eyewitness glasses here, that they, as the Magi, are excited to see the star for one of two reasons. One, they want to see probably the King of the Jews. They want to see this prophecy that they've heard about. But now there's a second reason. King Herod has sent them on a mission. And I know they probably would have heard of King Herod and his glorious power and maybe his paranoia and sometimes his anger. And if they don't fulfill the task that he has sent them to do, they're like, if we can't find him, King Herod's probably going to kill us. So they're motivated. And the star finally shows up again right over Bethlehem. And then it says they show up at the house. Now I'm going to pause here for a second, and I'm nervous I'm going to ruin your entire view of Christmas. Okay, not your entire view of Christmas, but here's some things you need to know about the Magi. The Magi show up at the house. If you have a nativity scene at home, and you've got the Magi in the stable and the manger and the donkey and the cows, like, the Magi likely are showing up somewhere between 1.5 and 2 years after Jesus' birth. So we're in a house at this point. We're no longer in some stable in Bethlehem. The room in the inn has dissipated, and they've probably found themselves a permanent living situation at this point, okay? So there's number one. We're showing up to Jesus, who's probably between 1 and 2 years old at this point. And I'm hoping that didn't ruin your entire view of Christmas. So they show up, right? And he's likely not in the manger. He's probably in a bed or in the room. But they do present him the gifts. The gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then they bow down and they worship him. They worship God with us, Emmanuel. And everything changes. Now, if you're thinking, how many were there? 2, 3, 10 magi? We don't really know. We know that there were 3 gifts. But what we do know is that this encounter with Jesus and then what they're going to experience shortly thereafter is going to change everything. So they're going to get to this spot and they encounter Jesus. They bend down and worship him. They give him these 3 gifts designated for royalty. And then I think the most significant part of the story happens. Verse 12. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. They've now had this encounter with Jesus, and they get this encounter with God. Now, we don't know if it was a physical manifestation of God in a dream, but God clearly shows up, warns them in a dream not to go back to Herod. And you know what would have happened? The ramifications of this belief would have been significant. Because again, like I said earlier, Herod probably is going to kill them. He's going to kill them if they don't come back. He's going to kill them if they don't find Jesus. But for some reason, their encounter with Jesus and how God reveals himself to them in a dream is compelling enough where they say, hey, we're not going back to angry, paranoid Herod. We're going back to our land of Orient by a different route. And then you know what follows. Jesus is taken by Joseph and Mary to Egypt. That fulfills a prophecy. He's protected and safe because, of course, Herod finds out he's outwitted by the Magi. He goes on this rampage trying to kill all the 2-year-olds and under in the region of Bethlehem. It gets scary and dire, but we know Jesus' time has not yet come. It hasn't yet come. God protects him, spares his life, and spares the Magi's as well. When I dive into this story and into this account, there are 2 big truths that jump off the pages of what maybe we're supposed to learn from the story of the Magi 2,000 years after it happened. And the first is this: an encounter with God changes everything. I feel like we know this. But do we actually know it? The Magi, pagans from a distant land, looking at the stars for meaning and for purpose, meet Jesus. They worship him. They experience a dream given to them by the Holy Spirit, by God. And everything is changed in this moment. Of course, we don't know anything about them after this moment. But I have to believe that this was so compelling that they weren't going to go back to Herod, that they went to the land of Orient and they said, we've met the Messiah, Jesus, who, as we're going to learn here in a couple chapters when Jesus begins his public ministry, that he is not just the Messiah for the Jews, but the Messiah for everyone. That everyone has now been invited into the kingdom of God. This is the gospel, that the Magi, who were pagans, who had been outcast from the people of Israel, get an encounter with God, with us, Emmanuel. And it changes everything. That same baby who's going to be born is going to grow up. He's going to teach, he's going to preach, he's going to heal, and he's going to move, and he's going to die. But he will not stay dead. He will rise again. Here's my hope, friends. That you believe that God with us, that experience was for you. If you've had an encounter with God, an encounter with Jesus, that encounter was for you. That following after Emmanuel, that was for you. What was accomplished on the cross was for you. He's seeing you. Everything changes for the Magi, and everything can change for you. If you feel like God is just speaking to you right now, and you're like, I want the gift. I want to believe that Jesus is who he says he is. I want to believe that Jesus died for me. He came to experience what I experience. Here's what's going to pop up right now. Theo, our digital pastor's email, theo@restorecc.org. If you're sitting there in your home, maybe you attend one of our in-person services, you're like, I want to trust out in Jesus that he was for me. Maybe you're going to walk that step out in baptisms. We're celebrating baptisms at our in-person locations this weekend, and you're like, I'm ready to take that step. Do not stop right now. Email Theo Davis. We want to go on that journey with you. Whether you're in Kansas City, St. Louis, Japan, or Australia, we want to celebrate what God is doing in your life. And that an encounter with him and trusting in him as Lord and Savior can change everything. I'm compelled because it's changed everything for me. And as I continue to follow after this person of Jesus, one truth continues to ring true for me as an encounter with God does change everything. But the second truth that I see is that we should trust God to direct our path. I kicked off this teaching with that story of me deciding not to go to K-State, Manhattan Christian, and going to Cornerstone. And for me, that's one of many instances where I've said, God, I trust you. I trust that you are opening a door, that you are making a way. The Magi are supposed to show up in Bethlehem, end up in Jerusalem. And then they end back in Bethlehem, and God encounters them in a dream, and they don't go back to Herod, but they go back another way. He is orchestrating them in a way that is working out his plan perfectly. The hardest part for us is that when we have that encounter or we see that open door, are we obedient and do we choose to take it? Because I imagine the temptation for the Magi was great. To go back to Herod, knowing that they were fearing for their own lives. God is leading and directing our paths. Sometimes he makes it clear the way we're supposed to go. Sometimes he opens 5 doors and said, just be faithful and be obedient and walk through them and trust after me. We have to continue to trust that God can do what he's going to do through us. That his way is best. We should trust his guidance and his leading. And understand that an encounter with God changes everything.